For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. That is a quote by John Winthrop in a famous sermon in Massachusetts Colony, 1630. It was later used in speeches by both JFK and Ronald Reagan, and probably others. Welcome to the United States of Amnesia. We are the podcast that reminds us of what we have forgotten. It is often said that history repeats itself. Mark Twain allegedly said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But over time, many topics have become clouded by biases and oversimplifications, or have become mythologized and now are misunderstood. Misunderstanding means learning the wrong lessons from history, perhaps, or even learning nothing at all. And that can leave us poorly prepared for history's next rhyme. In general, the 13 original colonies were separately administered under the Crown, but had similar political, constitutional, and legal systems, and aside from Maryland, each one was dominated by Protestant English speakers. The first of the colonies, Virginia, was established at Jamestown in 1607 for economic purposes. Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New England colonies were substantially motivated by their founders' concerns related to the practice of religion. Other colonies were founded for business and economic expansion, think Virginia, but also the Carolinas predominantly. The middle colonies, New York to Delaware, were established on the former Dutch colony of New Netherland and were mixed in terms of religious history and outlook. So let's discuss the colonies one by one, starting with the southern colonies. The religious history of the 13 original colonies was diverse and deeply shaped by a number of things, such as European conflicts, as we noted last time, reform movements, such as the First Great Awakening, and ideas about church and state relationships that were influenced by Age of Enlightenment thinking. Religion influenced settlement patterns, laws, education, politics, and relations with indigenous peoples. At the same time, the colonies gradually developed traditions of religious diversity that later influenced our First Amendment. Between 1625 and 1775, we should note, the colonial population grew from 2,000 to 2.4 million, largely displacing the region's Native Americans. The population included people subject to a system of slavery, which was legal in all of the colonies. Several American colonies were established primarily for religious reasons, largely to escape persecution in Europe or to establish specific religious communities. Key colonies included Massachusetts, and in particular we're talking about Puritans and Pilgrims, Maryland, in which we're talking about Catholics originally, Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers, and Rhode Island founded by dissidents of other colonies, and we'll get into that in a minute. Other religiously motivated colonies or settlements included Connecticut and New Haven, which eventually became part of Connecticut. We're going to start with Virginia. Jamestown in Virginia was the first. Virginia was founded in 1607 by the British, mainly for economic reasons, think tobacco. It was absolutely a Christian colony, settled by English Protestants, and it was required at the time that the colonists tithe to the Anglican Church. And this was true for probably 100 years or more, probably more than 100 years.
More than 100 years, because it's not until the 18th century that, the later 18th century, where that kind of becomes less dominant in people's thinking.
Well, I don't know about tithing specifically, but I can tell you that Virginia, the colony thereof, established the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, same thing, as its established church, its official church. And it remained the official church of Virginia both before and after the independence of the United States until 1786, when the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom disestablished Well, by then it became known as the Episcopal Church. After independence from England, we didn't want to have our church called the Church of England anymore, or Anglican, which means of England. So it became known as the Episcopal Church, which simply means governed by bishops.
And this was Thomas Jefferson's.
I was going to say, that was TJ.
Yes, that was one of his signature arrangements that he celebrated, and is on his I wouldn't say tomb or headstone because it's kind of an obelisk, but
That's one of the three things he was
He
proudest
wanted to be
of.
remembered that.
Yeah.
for
that,
that.
and president of the University of Virginia.
and Declaration of Independence.
Declaration of Independence. Anyway, we'll get into that when we get into the founders
Next time.
But there was a lot of thinking among founders from Virginia, certainly, about the idea that there should be great religious freedom, great freedom of conscience, and all of that. And that reflected itself eventually in 1786, Virginia disestablishing the Episcopal Church. But it took that long, so we're talking 175 years or whatever it is. And in fact, you had to hold public office. For example, you had to be a member of the Episcopal, the Anglican Church, Church of England, later Episcopal Church. You had to be any kind of public office holder up until, I guess, the disestablishment of the church in 1786.
So, I mean, we are going to get into this language about what constitutes an established church, because a lot of people see with the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment, which you read at the beginning last time, this is kind of what an established church looks like. You have to, in order to have full civil rights, you have to be part of that church. If you want to hold public office, you have to be part of that church.
And Blake mentioned tithing. And last time we discussed the idea of taxation.
It was taxation.
Taxation,
It-
right.
It was taxes.
But that's what it would amount to. It amounted to tithing.
Yeah.
And we discussed that last time too, about would an established church tax people and how would that all work? Well, Virginia gives you an example of that in colonial times.
But yeah, you get funded by the state. You have to be part of that church if that's if that is the dominant state church that's being funded, and if you are not, then you're kind of like out in the cold then.
So Virginia was established not as a religious colony,
Correct.
but as a business enterprise.
Yes.
However, it did have a specific religious requirement and a specific established church, which had influence on taxes and life and everything else there.
And this is not that different from what's going on in England.
Yes. They're importing from England what was going on in England in a lot of ways. Right.
It's not something new and different.
It's not an original idea, really. It's just Virginia being just like England, right? Because they were Englishmen coming over, continuing to be Englishmen in the New World. So that's Virginia.
Right. Now we're going to talk about Maryland. Maryland was founded in 1634. There's some disagreement over the date. I think the charter was 1632, but people came over in 1635.
Yeah, it was kind of founded during the period from 1632 to 1634 is what sources will tell you.
But it was founded by Catholic pilgrims. Okay, see, these are English Catholics who fled England because they did not want to be subjected to the Protestant Anglican Church.
The established church.
The established church, right,
in
of England.
Of England, yes.
They wanted to practice their Catholic faith, and so they left in two ships, or at least the biggest initial group. The Ark and the Dove were the names of those ships, and they founded the colony of Maryland. And there is a famous story, which is commemorated by a plaque on St. Clement's Island in the Potomac River Basin up near St. Mary's County, where they landed, and they all disembarked onto this island and, fell down on their knees and had a Catholic mass. So yes, Maryland was founded as a Christian colony, a uniquely Catholic one.
They were led by George Calvert. There's a county in Maryland called Calvert County. And what the colony did, though, it was founded as a Catholic colony, but according to what I've read about it, it extended freedom of worship to all Trinitarian Christians.
Because Unitarian
Trinitarian meaning those who believed in one Christian God who exists as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And they did that in 1649. So that's only about 15 years or so after the colony was founded. They extended that. So very, very quickly they were becoming more religiously tolerant. You still had to be Christian, you still had to be Trinitarian, but at least you didn't have to be only Catholic.
Yes, toleration did not extend to all religions or even all forms of Christianity.
Yes.
This is kind of reflecting, just something to keep in mind. Over in England at the time, Catholicism is more or less illegal. You could not, when they're coming ashore and having this mass, this was something that was more or less forbidden.
Correct.
In Britain at the time. And there were only like, you had different Catholic landed gentry that would have a priest come by and say mass occasionally in the family chapel. If the priest was found on there, you were subject to be arrested. Your family was subject to be arrested.
It was considered treasonous, wasn't it? To
yes,
be Catholic,
particularly after the gunpowder plot, where Catholic renegades wanted to blow up Parliament.
What year was that?
I want to say that's 1605.
Yeah, the gunpowder plot. Unsuccessful assassination attempt against King James I and the English Parliament.
And the entire royal family.
Yes, orchestrated by Robert Catesby. A group of English Catholics planned to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament on November 5th, 1605. And one of the conspirators, Guy Fawkes, was guarding barrels of gunpowder in the cellar underneath the House of Lords. And to this day in England, they have Guy Fawkes Day, where they celebrate his...
Remember the 5th of November.
Yeah, they celebrate his arrest and pretty brutal execution.
Yeah.
Yes, they celebrate that.
They didn't mess around.
Yeah, they didn't mess around in those days. But that was the context of that, as Catholicism was considered treasonous.
Yeah,
by English Protestants,
it had
anyway.
the same connotations. Catholicism had the same connotations in Britain at the time as, say, some backward-thinking people have towards Islam now. It's a religion of terrorists.
Staying in the southern colonies, let's talk about the Carolinas. What we now know as North and South Carolina was originally one large land grant and later was separated. The province of Carolina was initially chartered in 1629, and initial settlements were established after 1651. That charter was voided in 1660 by Charles II, and a new charter was issued in 1663, making it a proprietary colony.
At which point it became known as the Carolina Colony officially.
The Carolina province was divided into separate proprietary colonies, north and south, in 1712, before both became royal colonies in 1729. So in North Carolina, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and that split had no religious content to it at all.
No.
What became North Carolina and what became South Carolina were culturally and economically very different from one another, and often in dispute with one another, and that's why they were split. But there was no religious content to that.
Both colonies, I would say, were established for largely economic purposes as opposed to religious. In North Carolina, which was more religiously diverse and more loosely governed than Virginia, it included Anglicans, Baptists, Presbyterians, and Quakers. And a note here, frontier conditions weakened centralized church control.
So they're not having the same level of control established, as say, like the established Anglican Church in Virginia.
Right.
And oh, by the way, in addition to business purposes, another motivation for founding the original Carolina colony was was a military reason, as a buffer against invasion of the British colonies from Spanish Florida, which was, of course, to the south. So that was another consideration. But again, a non-religious one.
Right. All right. South Carolina was founded for similar reasons, economic more than religious. It was officially Anglican, but economically oriented and relatively tolerant in practice. Charleston became religiously diverse and included Huguenots, Jews, Presbyterians, and Baptists. And we might want to mention what the Huguenots were.
Well, they were actually a group of Calvinist French Protestants who had been given the right to practice their religion early in the 17th century under something called the Edict of Nantes. And then in 1682, Louis XIV revoked this. So if you were going to be French, you had to be Catholic, just as you had to be Protestant if you were going to be English. And this was really one of the stupider things that Louis did, most historians believe, because all of these Huguenots were very talented. For some reason, a large number of people who were in the cloth trade were Huguenots. And these people fled for religious purposes, and they ended up going to a number of places, particularly South Carolina, particularly Charleston. There is still a Huguenot church there, which ancestors of mine basically founded when they fled there. But they would basically go through England. They had a large concentration of people in Spitalfields in London, and they were all weavers. And this kind of decimated the French cloth trade and enhanced the Dutch and English cloth trade. And all of Louis' biographers say this was a bad call on his part. It was orthodoxy for orthodoxy's sake, and it didn't really benefit the state whatsoever.
We're going to round out the southern colonies with Georgia, which was a later colony founded in 1732. It began as a colony established to provide a new start to people in debt. It was the brainchild of James Oglethorpe. He favored social equality as reflected in his design of the city of Savannah. Slavery was not permitted, neither initially was alcohol. It might be better to define Georgia as a charity colony versus a penal one, even though people in debtor's prison were identified to be a source for colonists.
And for those who don't know this, in England it was a crime to not repay your debts. So if you didn't repay your debts, you could be put in debtor's prison. And it's been pointed out that's kind of stupid, because how can you ever repay your debts if you're in prison?
I know.
But anyway, that's a different topic. But it was a crime. And so this was a way of giving these people a fresh start in life, where they could, start to earn a living again, I guess, and maybe hopefully pay their debts off someday, but at least have a fresh start in life.
Or at least be prosperous members of society.
Yeah. My reading on this very quickly, too, is that Georgia had wound up having financial problems, because it turns out that not a lot of these actual debtors actually came over originally. And another issue was that since you have a bunch of debtors coming, they obviously don't have a lot of money. So Georgia ran into a lot of financial difficulties because it's people with no money are settling the colony. But at any rate, Oglethorpe did not found the colony for specifically religious reasons, but his idea of social equality and giving debtors a second chance and everything was probably informed by some sort of sense of Christian charity or something. I'm
yes,
assuming.
And there were people like that, you know.
But that wasn't a specific religious reason for founding Georgia. By the way, Georgia also was founded partly too as a military for military reasons, as another buffer area against Spanish Florida in case the Spanish ever invaded.
And we should mention that Spanish Florida was also Christian,
but
founded
Catholic.
Catholic.
And
You're
Catholic.
right.
You know, I mean, if we look at just the United States, and I mean, the United States comes out of 13 colonies, but there are all these other religious traditions that exist in places that are still America, that were not necessarily Protestant, and the people were not necessarily speaking English. And they, too, were part of, you know, what constitutes America these days.
So Georgia, just concluding the Georgia story here, the idea of creating a colony intended to foster yeoman farming on an equal basis was the objective.
One thing to keep in mind with the southern colonies, not everybody is Episcopalian, and the Episcopalian Church doesn't have, with the exception of, say, Virginia, doesn't have the same control that it would have, say, over in England. But it was the dominant church in the South. You know, a very much a hierarchical organization that fostered. You had bishops and all sorts of organization that was focused on an order that was not unlike what you had over in Britain. And this is not the case that we will find in other colonies as well.
Right. Essentially what they did was they were Church of England,
yes,
back in England. They came over to the colonies. They remained Church of England. It wasn't called the Episcopal Church yet. They remained Church of England. You could call it Anglican if you want to. But they just brought over what they already had and just kept doing it when they came to the colonies.
This was the rule book. This was the plan.
Yeah.
So they stuck to it.
That was the church where they were from, and it was the church where they were going, and that was it.
Yes. They were not trying to. They were trying to do a continuity, as opposed to religious freedom, is what they were looking
because
for.
Because they were trying to do business in the New World,
Yeah.
right? Not change religion in any way.
Let's move on to what are called the middle colonies, from New York all the way down to Delaware. The New York colony was officially founded in 1664, although it was earlier settled by the Dutch as part of New Netherland.
That was in 1624, the Dutch.
I was going to say it was probably a good bit earlier, yeah.
Yeah, so 40 years before. What happened was the British fought the Second Anglo-Dutch War against the Netherlands, and as part of that war, they took control of New Netherland from the Dutch, and it became New York under British control.
It was religiously diverse from the beginning due to its Dutch roots and commercial priorities. It included Dutch Reformed Christians, Anglicans, Lutherans, Jews, and others. After the English takeover in 1664, the colony remained very pluralistic.
The Dutch Reformed Church arose in the Netherlands, of course, because the Netherlands was a Spanish possession in the 1500s, and King Charles V of Spain had instituted the Inquisition, and the Inquisition included the Netherlands. And so, seeking religious freedom from Catholicism, Protestants had formed what became the Dutch Reformed Church in the latter part of the 1500s. They were a Calvinist denomination. They believed in the predestination of souls, meaning that God had already elected or chosen those who would be saved. That kind of an argument. They did have a group called the Arminians, also called the Remonstrants, who wanted to have a looser interpretation of predestination, that people had some agency, some limited control over their own salvation, but that was rejected later by the Synod of Dort, which occurred from 1618 to 1619. That produced the Canons of Dort, which condemned the idea that people had any agency over their ultimate salvation, and returned to the more strict interpretation. So that's who the Dutch Reformed were.
But if we look at kind of the makeup that Blake has mentioned here, not unlike what we're seeing with the southern colonies, this is essentially what was going on over in the Netherlands at the time. You had a very pluralistic attitude towards religions. And, you were allowing... There was a large concentration of Jews who had settled in the Netherlands after they'd been kicked out of Spain by Queen Isabel. The philosopher Spinoza would be part of that group that was in the Netherlands. So the fact that we're seeing Dutch Reformed, we're seeing Anglicans, Lutherans, Jews in New York, that's not all that surprising given who founds the colony.
Well, much as the Church of England was the official church of England, the Dutch Reformed Church was the official church of the Netherlands until 1798, when it was disestablished as that. So, like you're saying, the Dutch came over, founded New Netherland, brought the official religion with them, practiced it. That was their religion there.
Yeah.
But even under Dutch control, again, as you're saying, New York New Netherland at the time, had a reputation as being very religiously tolerant.
Yeah.
And it continued to be so under when the British took over and it became New York. It continued to be a religiously tolerant area with a diversity of beliefs.
And I think this was the first place that had a dwelling Jewish community.
Yeah, I think so.
Because
I mean, there was a thriving Jewish community in Amsterdam at the time. Again, these people who had refugeed from Spain, the Sephardic Jews, had settled there.
Moving on to New Jersey, which was also founded in 1664, religious diversity was encouraged in order to attract settlers. Settlers included Quakers, Presbyterians, Dutch Reformed communities, and Anglicans. And no single church dominated the colony.
However, the school that was established there, Princeton, that was originally Presbyterian.
What became New Jersey was originally settled by the Swedes, the Swedish Empire, in 1638 as New Sweden. Then it became a part of the Dutch colony of New Netherland in 1655. And then in 1664, it became the provinces of East Jersey and West Jersey, two separate colonies. after the British seized the area from the Dutch during, again, the Second Anglo-Dutch War. And both of the Jerseys, as they were called at the time, were founded as commercial enterprises. And in 1665, the proprietors of both of the Jerseys issued the Concession and Agreement, and that promised religious freedom to all settlers in what were then the two New Jersey colonies. And so the two colonies became a haven for Quakers, Puritans, and other dissenters who faced persecution elsewhere. And then for strictly secular reasons, East Jersey and West Jersey emerged to form New Jersey in 1702.
So not really, we do have a religious presence, but we don't necessarily have a religious motivation in this instance.
Right. I mean, I assume since New Jersey was part of New Netherland until 1655, then I assume the Dutch Reformed came over and that was the official church and all of that. But again, why would it wouldn't be different from up in New York because they were the same colony. They were both New Netherland at the time. So you had that tradition there, and then under British control, they actually, overtly made the Concession and Agreement statement promising religious freedom to all settlers.
Moving on to Pennsylvania, which was founded in 1681 by William Penn as a refuge for Quakers. The Quakers emphasized equality, pacifism, simplicity, and religious tolerance. And Pennsylvania became one of the most religiously open colonies. It's actually an extremely interesting story. It was viewed as a holy experiment.
Yes, a holy experiment to bring in religious diversity from all over Europe, and it incorporated a lot of people who were being persecuted as religious minorities in not just England, but also Germany. We have this expression, Pennsylvania Dutch, that's actually meaning, it's Deutsch.
Deutsch.
Meaning German.
Mispronounced as
But we
German.
have...
I never knew that.
Yeah, they're not Dutch at all. They're Deutsch.
Yeah.
Okay.
My
I'm glad you said that.
Yes.
My family is Pennsylvania Dutch on my maternal grandfather's side. They're from Pennsylvania. Yeah.
So you have people from places like Moravia, which is in what is now Czechia. I got to catch myself there because it keeps changing its name. But Moravia was a source for colonies. We're getting colonies from different parts of Europe than just England and France, and even the Netherlands here. And it's sort of like the floodgates open up, and Pennsylvania becomes this huge, tolerant experiment in religious freedom and liberty there. So you do have, in the case of Pennsylvania, kind of the myth made flesh here, in the sense that, yes, people established the colony for religious reasons, and it promoted religious freedom and religious diversity.
And you have Mennonites, Lutherans, Catholics, and Jews.
Yes.
There was a Jewish population in Philly.
Yes.
And the Amish, of course, are up in
The Amish, yes.
Pennsylvania.
The big problem, though, when people have looked at the history of the colony, and I'm going to say the best book I've ever read on Pennsylvania's establishment is a book called From Meeting House to Counting House. The Quakers, once they settled there, Pennsylvania became a very important colony, and Philadelphia became the leading city. Not New York, not Boston, not Charleston, but Philadelphia was the leading city in the New World amongst the English colonies. And the Quakers were getting rich off of this. Diversity actually pays, contrary to what some people would argue. And they soon found themselves in a kind of conundrum, which led some of them to basically embrace a purely commercial identity, meeting the counting house, and then others who would kind of retreat from that world, meeting house, particularly when it came to the need to establish a militia to defend the colony during various times of conflict.
We should probably define what Quakerism meant, what it meant to be a Quaker.
Well, I mean, in terms of the Quakers are very strong supporters of equality, not only amongst the sexes, but also amongst races as well. They were the first people to favor abolition. Quaker services can be maddening to people who've never been to them because...
Weren't they like meditative and
Well,
quiet?
it's not just meditative. It's like someone, if they are moved by the Spirit to speak, and it doesn't matter who you are. I mean, we were talking about like the Episcopal Church with its hierarchy. There is absolutely no hierarchy. One can be a leader without being moved by the Holy Spirit to speak there.
And to quake.
And to quake.
Which would be what, speaking in tongues? Or just...
No, they didn't do that.
The Quakers believe in the inner life, which is the belief that God speaks directly to every individual, making everyone capable of experiencing the divine. They believe in spiritual equality. Because all people carry the divine spark, Quakers historically have championed radical equality, including the spiritual leadership of women and opposition to racism. They believe that God's truth is continually revealed and that divine communication is not limited to Scripture. As you were saying, so they sit in silent meetings.
Yes.
And they wait for the Spirit to move them, and whoever's moved by the Spirit can stand and share a message. And if no one ever speaks, the entire hour they spend together could be silent.
Yes.
I have read that, yeah.
And they seek unity through shared listening and waiting to discern what they believe is God's will, rather than in doing things like voting on church matters and things like that.
But just think about this in comparison to what we're looking at in the other colonies, just why Quakerism was kind of one of these prescribed beliefs in one of the colonies or some of the colonies, that you have no hierarchy. There is text other than the Bible, because God is speaking through you, not just through the Bible. The Bible is not the be-all and end-all. It's not about interpreting the Bible. It's interpreting what God's will is at that particular moment. So you can see why this particular group would not necessarily be accepted in some of the other colonies. And there's a total lack of hierarchy. So like some woman with no education, who maybe had read the Bible, could go and cross swords with a bishop in Virginia.
Which was unheard of in those days.
Which would be unheard of on so many different levels.
Right.
But
The core belief that in the inner light, the presence of God existing in every person, means the logical outcome of that is that Quakers believe that no priests or rituals are needed to connect with the divine. So that pretty much throws out all church hierarchy and everybody else's religious practices.
Yeah.
They're all superfluous because God speaks to you directly.
For them, yes.
For them, yeah.
They're not going to, they will not go in and say, you have a hierarchy, so you're wrong. They would take the position, we don't believe in that. You are free to believe that if you wish. So.
They have an historic commitment to nonviolence.
Yes.
Many of them will refuse military service. They have an emphasis on working for social justice and conflict resolution. They strive to live unadorned lives. They try to maintain rigorous honesty in all dealings. And because of that, they refuse to swear oaths in court because it implies one might be dishonest at other times.
Yes.
They believe in treating all people with equal respect and in actively working to support those who are marginalized. There are some branches that are different from others. Some are evangelical. Others are more universalist, welcoming members who find truth in various faith traditions or secular philosophies. So they have there's different branches of Quakerism as well. And they're known as they're officially known as the Religious Society of Friends.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. But
they were a new thing. They originated in 17th century England. So at the time of the foundation of these colonies, they were a new branch of Christian belief.
Yes.
If that's the right way to put it.
But they were, but because of so many tenets of their faith ran counter to what would be considered good, orderly. They're not Presbyterians, they're not Episcopalians, and this whole military thing was
a problem at times.
It presented a problem, say, with Franklin, and we can get into that later on when we talk about the Founding Fathers. But there were issues with that, like what exactly do you do to defend your colony if there's a war going on?
Well, that had to be overcome to get them to serve in the Revolutionary
War. not everybody, and
some didn't. I'm sure.
Some didn't, because they. If you've ever seen the film or read the book Friendly Persuasion, you have family that has the Civil War going on around them, and they're totally like, we're not going to take part in this, but hey, we're also fighting slavery. How do you deal with this? There's all sorts of moral dilemmas to this approach that come along.
Pacifism leads to many moral dilemmas.
Yes, it does.
And Richard Nixon was a Quaker.
Really?
Yes.
Was he not?
Yes, he was.
He was raised as one, anyway. Yeah, that was his...
He was raised as one, and he actually went to... Whittier College was a Quaker institution. The Quakers actually went west.
In California.
And established communities out there. So Whittier was...
He did not practice the pacifism part.
No. No, he did not, because Richard Nixon spent his entire lifetime trying to flee from his upbringing.
Moving on to Delaware, we'll round out the middle colonies with Delaware.
Delaware has a complicated history.
A little bit complicated. Became a British colony in 1664, but it was earlier settled by the Dutch.
Even earlier by the Swedes.
Yes.
Again, the Swedes were there. The Swedes first settled in Delaware in 1631. That settlement was quickly abandoned. But then the Swedes came back in 1638 and resettled it, and it became New Sweden in 1638. Then the Dutch took control in 1655, just like they had done further north in New Jersey. Then the British again the Second Anglo-Dutch War, took over Delaware in 1664 from the Dutch. And then here's where it gets complicated and confusing. They administered it, the British did, as part of New York until Pennsylvania annexed it in 1682. Then Delaware was part of Pennsylvania, but in 1704 it received its own representative assembly. But it continued to share a governor with Pennsylvania in the colonial times until 1776. And when the United States declared independence, right at about simultaneously with that, more or less, it finally fully broke away from Pennsylvania as the state of Delaware, with its own government, its own governor.
Do you know who the royal governor was in 1776?
I do not.
Franklin's illegitimate son, who they grew to loathe each other. He was actually a loyalist.
Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah.
There was even, and then we talked about Maryland earlier, there were some disputes over Maryland saying it should own Delaware. Delaware really didn't want to be owned by Maryland, but then Pennsylvania. And the thing about it is, too, that Delaware and Pennsylvania, not for, I don't know if religious reasons figured into this at all, or how much they did, but the Delaware and Pennsylvania, neither one of them really wanted to be combined as one colony. They just were because of whatever royal edict or something.
It was more of an administrative thing.
It was an administrative issue. They were not really terribly. They were kind of separate societies, really, from one another. But I don't know of any necessarily religious component to that.
It was religiously mixed with Swedish Lutherans, Dutch Reformed settlers, Anglicans, and Quakers.
It was predominantly settled by Quakers in the north, but then that's close to Pennsylvania. That makes sense.
So there's bleeding.
Right. And by English, mostly English from Maryland, and their African slaves in the south of Delaware. And another thing to throw in the mix here is that in the late 18th century, and we're going to get into the Second Great Awakening in a future episode, but in the late 18th century, near the beginning of the Second Great Awakening, itinerant Methodist preachers were in southern Delaware, and they gained a foothold there, and they got converts among both whites and among African and slaves in southern Delaware. So there was a Methodist presence there at that point. But that's off in the future.
But where we are in the 17th century, there are no Methodists yet.
There are no Methodists yet. That's not until the late 18th century.
Yes.
Yeah, like the 1790s when that happened.
Yes.
But I'm just throwing that in the mix since we're talking about religious foundations.
Yes.
Yeah, there actually was a noteworthy Methodist foothold there eventually.
Moving on to the New England colonies, I saved these for last because this is where the religious influence for the founding of many of these colonies gets very intricate and complicated.
Just like Calvinism itself.
All right, so the very first one was the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts, founded in 1620 by the Pilgrims, a separatist group distinct from the Puritans, which later founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1629-1630 time frame. But Plymouth Colony, that's from which we understand the Thanksgiving story. The Pilgrims believed that the Church of England was beyond reform and wanted complete separation. So they left. Now, these Pilgrims were originally English. They had moved to Amsterdam in Holland, right?
Still the sink of depravity.
To get away from the Church of England.
What do you mean by that?
The sink of depravity, that means just they found the society like depraved in the sense that it was they were looking
the Puritans
for
found the society in Amsterdam to be depraved.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to make clear.
Yes.
Of who you're talking about.
And
there. Yeah.
you know, they are finding depravity wherever they look.
Yeah. Okay.
So then they left Holland, founded the colony, the Plymouth Colony, 1620. The colony emphasized covenant theology and tightly knit religious community life.
And so it's worth kind of just the reason I made that comment about sink of depravity here. Okay, we are not looking in this instance for toleration. We are looking for the ability. They felt themselves discriminated against. They felt their way of life was a higher standard for living close to God here, and they wish to impose these standards on other people.
Right. So let's come back to that and let's clarify where this comes from then, just to make sure that everybody's with us here. Right. So
yes.
The Puritans in England,
Yes.
of which the Pilgrims were a subset, right?
Yes.
The Puritans in England thought that pretty much everything that had gone on in Christianity since the first century?
Fourth century.
The 4th century AD.
Yeah.
Everything that had gone on since the 4th century AD had been diminishment of Christianity.
Yes.
Corrupting.
Yes.
They were against the Catholic Church. They didn't like the gold. They didn't like all the things that the Catholic Church had done. They didn't like
all the rituals.
The rituals and the
The
wealth.
hierarchy, the Pope.
They thought they were graven images. They thought, et cetera, et cetera. They were against all those things, very much so. That was what the
altars,
Puritans
candles, stained glass. You know,
they hated all of it.
They hated all of it.
Right. They thought that it was a diminishment of Christianity and a corruption of it. That's
and idolatry.
Idolatry too. So that's their frame. That's their frame of reference. That's what they were against in England.
Yes.
Right. The Pilgrims. So some of the Puritans thought they could stay in England and either fix the church, and they thought that the Church of England was too reflective of the Catholic influence. I suppose.
Yes.
Right. I mean, because the Church of England had broken away by this time from
with Henry VIII back in the previous century.
But I guess the Church of England, the High Church, was very Catholic-looking, Catholic light as far as they were concerned.
It was Anglo-Catholic.
Therefore, just as corrupt would be their viewpoint.
Well, it's evolving.
Yeah.
The Anglican Church is evolving from the time Henry VIII breaks it away. He is insisting he's right and the Pope is wrong. He is the correct Catholic.
Right.
Then you get Edward VI, who comes in with all of these hardline Calvinist thinkings, and there is an actual full-on break where there's a prayer book, there's also priests can get married, all sorts of things are going on there
right.
that are inconsistent with traditional Catholic dogma. Then there's kind of a settlement under Queen Elizabeth I, which kind of allows this creation, which is still evolving, which is still subject to the head of the church, which is the monarch.
You're talking the Church of England.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so when we're at the 17th century, Charles I wants to standardize religious practices throughout the entire realm, to include the Presbyterians, which gets them into trouble with Scotland. And he wants to introduce all of these smells and bells, all of these rituals, all of these things which Puritans are going to regard as idolatrous, which he's just regarding as pleasant to look at and able to bring you to God that way.
Quite similar to the Catholicism that so offended Puritans.
Yes.
Even though it wasn't Catholic anymore, it was quite similar in a lot of ways, in ways that Puritans did not approve of.
And Puritans kind of saw Catholicism as the back door to absolutism. So there's a lot of other things that are caught up with this, like the role of Parliament and the ability to have representation to deal with the monarch, to kind of avoid a kind of absolutist government like what you saw on the continent with things like inquisitions and punishments to people who dissent.
So that's why the Puritans were against how the Church of England was
Headed
under
Charles.
in the 1600s under Charles.
Well, in the 1620s and 1630s.
Right. That's why they were opposed to that. Now, there were Puritans who thought they could stay in England and fix the church.
And they did, and
Correct.
they cut off Charles's head eventually.
During the English Civil War. Yes. But they thought they could do that.
Yes.
There were the Pilgrims, were a subset of the Puritans, who decided that the Church of England was so corrupt it was beyond hope. Nothing could be done about it.
We need to form our own.
And to continue to live in England was impossible for them because of the direction the church was going in terms of Charles trying to force everybody to follow.
And even James.
And James. So they decided that the only hope was to leave.
Yeah.
And hence we wind up with the American myth, of the Pilgrims, were these people who just wanted religious freedom.
Exactly.
And they wanted to go somewhere they could have religious freedom.
Exactly.
If you talk to English people, you'll get a very different perspective on it, which is that the Pilgrims were a bunch of tiresome scolds who went around telling everybody how to live their lives all the time. And the English people, a lot of them, were more than happy to see them leave. There's this new place you go to over in North America. Why don't you go over there? And you can all tell each other what to do and leave us alone.
And practice your intolerance over there.
Yes.
Well, and in fact, I was going to say, you're kind of taking the words out of my mouth, Blake, is that, was the question really they wanted religious freedom? Not for everybody.
No, they wanted religious tyranny.
They wanted religious freedom for themselves so that they could go over and be the ones who were oppressing people who disagreed with them. They didn't want to be the ones who were being oppressed. They wanted to be the oppressors.
Right.
Yes.
So the American myth tells only a fraction of the story. It's much more complicated than that.
And that plays out even further in the colonies.
Yes.
So the Pilgrims come to Plymouth Colony in 1620.
Established the Plymouth Colony in 1620, from which grows the Thanksgiving tradition that we understand. And they were helped by the Native Americans quite a bit and helped them survive. Now, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded in 1629, 1630 by another group of English Puritans seeking to build a godly society, not primarily for religious freedom in the modern sense. These Puritans wanted to reform the Church of England, which they believed remained too Catholic in practice.
And was headed that way.
Dissenters were often punished or expelled. Now, one of those was Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, who were banished for challenging Puritan authorities, and they later founded the colony of Rhode Island.
Yes. And Rhode Island is kind of like this island of tolerance that exists in New England at the time.
Now, the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony at some point merged.
Eventually,
They merged, right?
Yes.
And just as a little geographic quirk, too, for people that don't know this, what is now the state of Maine was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony for a long time. It didn't become a separate, and part of the state as well, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts after independence. It didn't become its own separate state until 1820. So anyway, this was also
as
Maine.
part of the Missouri Compromise.
Yeah, but that's a whole different story.
So the Puritans, different groups, settled in Massachusetts. Now, they did practice their own brand of intolerance, and a target of theirs were Quakers, actually. And they often accused the Quakers of being witches, which was very difficult to disprove. And many of them were hung or burned or other things.
Well, who are you communing with? When you're in your meeting house, is it Satan?
So it's not an exaggeration to say that from the point of view of Puritans, the Quakers might have been engaging in satanic rituals and doing their very unusual, by Puritan standards, very unusual services that they
where you have women leading them, or all sorts of things that are inconsistent with the hierarchical nature of society that the Puritans envisioned. This ran so counter to the Quakers. The Quakers, we've seen what they were able to do in Pennsylvania. Where we're going with what's happening in Massachusetts, all of these guys are going to morph into Congregationalist churches, and Congregationalist churches are generally concentrated in New England, at odds with what we're seeing in the South the church is run by the congregation. It's not a hierarchical organization like you would see in Virginia, correct?
And let's get back to Congregationalism in just a second. I will just note that the Connecticut colony, founded in 1636, was founded largely by Puritan settlers from the neighboring Massachusetts Bay Colony. These settlers wanted to build communities based on strict Protestant religious principles, especially Congregationalism.
Yes.
And we should define that.
Well, it's basically Calvinism, but no hierarchy at all.
Yeah, so
as distinct from, say, like Presbyterianism or the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church. There is no hierarchy. The congregation runs the church.
Yeah, the founder of Connecticut was a guy named Thomas Hooker. And he left the Massachusetts Bay Colony because he led a group of Puritans from the Massachusetts Bay Colony who disagreed with the Massachusetts policy of limiting suffrage to what were called free men. Free men were defined as people, I guess all male, but I don't know. I mean, did women get a say in those days yet?
Not in Massachusetts.
Not in Massachusetts, right? So free men, literally men, who could pass a detailed interrogation on their religious views to make sure that they were, pure enough and such. Well, Hooker and his followers decided that that was too strict, and they wanted greater suffrage, voting ability, I guess in religious affairs, in the way congregations were run, which leads to your point about congregationalism and no hierarchy. So Hooker wanted, in Connecticut, it wasn't so much that he wanted necessarily greater freedom of religious practice or anything. He was a Puritan. He was a Puritan, but he wanted more Puritans more people to be able to have a say in what the congregation did.
Yes,
I guess is the way to think of it. So it was a dispute over that. I don't think it had a lot of other content of dispute over religious doctrine other than that, and from what I saw, but I may be wrong about that.
Over time, Connecticut became more religiously diverse. By the late 1600s and 1700s, groups such as Anglicans, Baptists, and Quakers had established communities despite facing various levels of discrimination from the dominant Congregational church.
So there still was.
This is in Connecticut.
So there still was discrimination against them, though. So that follows the Massachusetts practice then, right?
So you do have, we do need to talk, I think we've discussed this, but we are seeing, along with this quest for religious liberty, we also have requests for religious intolerance to be permitted in these New England colonies.
Which leads us to Rhode Island. It's another great story in this narrative. Founded in 1636 by Roger Williams after he was expelled from Massachusetts for his religious beliefs. Became the most religiously tolerant colony in New England. Supported separation of church and state and freedom of conscience. It welcomed Baptists, Quakers, Jews, and other minority groups.
Williams himself was a deeply religious Puritan, but he did not believe that you should force that on everybody around you. Kind of interesting variation on a theme there, right? So
right, exactly.
He himself, and he might even, my understanding is he might even urge you to, adopt more Puritan ways or something, but he wouldn't force it on you. He believed he believed that neither the church nor the state should regulate individual conscience or spiritual beliefs. Because he believed that forced worship, in other words, you're forced to do it by a church or state authority, right? Forced worship corrupts faith. And that and also another thing that he disagreed with the people in Massachusetts on was that he believed that Native Americans were equal to European settlers.
Yes.
Goodness.
As fellow human beings. And that the seizure of their land by Europeans was wrong. That did not go over well in Massachusetts, which is part of the reason he was invited to leave.
Asked to leave.
He was a devout Christian who lived his life according to Scripture. He believed in the divinity of Christ, but nonetheless insisted on freedom of religious belief and practice for Quakers, with whom he strongly disagreed on theological matters, as well as Jews and others in Rhode Island. Yeah. Newport, Rhode Island was one of the first
and there is still a synagogue
cities
there.
To have a significant Jewish settlement.
Population.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
It is still there. It is. We will get into that when we talk about Washington, because that synagogue plays a role in Washington's expression for religious beliefs, but that is one of the oldest synagogues in the United States.
So Rhode Island is one of the earliest experiments in broad religious liberty in the English-speaking world, and it is actually quite a jewel in the colonial times in terms of religious affinity, right?
Now,
The religious outlook.
In New England, though, Rhode Island has an interesting reputation. It is referred to sometimes as Rogues Island, and this might reflect a certain degree of intolerance that is residual. Also, they have a high tolerance, probably as high a tolerance for political corruption as Louisiana has, which is saying something. And so Rhode Island is always seen as like this exceptional spot, even by today's standards, in New England, talking to people from New England.
In terms of acceptance of corruption?
Well, in terms of just not being as strict.
As strict. Okay. All right.
The lack of strictness
Okay.
that exists
Right.
in Rhode Island. And I think that this is a residual approach that people are taking because, there's certain habits of thought that persist even after their original rationale has left. And I think this is part and parcel of that. We'll wait and see what people from New England have to say about this, hopefully, when we air.
Rounding out the New England colonies is New Hampshire, which was founded in 1629, initially tied very closely to the Massachusetts colonies and influenced by Puritanism. Over time, it became somewhat more religiously mixed and less rigidly controlled than Massachusetts Bay.
And it was founded specifically as a commercial enterprise. It was founded for strictly secular reasons. It was thought that the area had significant timber, fur, and fishery resources, and it was settled by people who wanted to exploit those resources. So, whatever the influence of the religious practices around them, remember that Massachusetts Bay Colony included what is now Maine as well as what is now Massachusetts. So that was on both sides of New Hampshire. So I'm sure that had some effect on what happened in New Hampshire, but there was no religious content to its foundation.
Right.
Nowadays, New Hampshire is where people from Massachusetts go to buy liquor at discounted prices.
Yes. Yes, the original Saturday Night Live, I believe, mentioned that back in 1977 or something like 70.
There is truth
or 1980, I should say.
There is truth to this. It's they do not, the taxes are much lower in New Hampshire than they are elsewhere.
So we have a mixed bag here of how the 13 colonies were founded, what the reasons for their foundation were. Very much a mixed bag.
Right. And we need to bear in mind also Canada was settled by the British and the French, which were also Christian nations. As we mentioned, Florida was founded by, settled by the Spanish, which was Catholic.
Yes.
The French settled the interior of what was going to become the United States.
Yeah.
Correct.
Not in great numbers, but they were there, so sure.
They were exploiting the furs. You didn't really need established settlements.
Yeah.
You just needed places to pick up the spoils of your harvesting and your trading with the Indians. You didn't need, so New Orleans could accomplish a great deal for the French.
So let's zoom out here. So what do we think then? So the proposition that that some people make that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. We've gone before the foundation of the country to look at the colonies that actually made it up, which were forged together to make the country.
Yes.
And what we're seeing is some of them were not found for religious reasons at all.
But they had religion in them.
Well, they had religion in them.
But you don't have that anywhere in the country.
And it's all Christian. It's all Christian.
In the world. Religion is everywhere.
It's all Christian.
Yeah.
Religion is everywhere. And yes, it's the people founding the colonies were Christian, but the colonies were not necessarily founded for reasons of religion.
Some were, some weren't.
Some weren't.
Right.
So if the proposition is that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and then you go back before that and look at how were the colonies founded that wound up making up the future United States?
Right.
It is by no means true that they were founded for religious reasons. Some were not. I would say that's the first thing that I would say.
Yeah.
And then another thing I would say is that if we want to look at the idea of is there an established religion or should there be an established religion in the United States?
Which some people want.
When we look at the colonies, we find out that like Virginia in particular, had an established religion, but a lot of them did not. So there isn't I guess what I'm trying to get at here is you can't look at the foundation of the colonies that later made up the United States and make a broad claim that there was a religious test for their creation by any stretch. I don't think you can make that claim. There was not.
And both Pennsylvania and Rhode Island were actually enclaves of
Tolerance.
And openness
Well, the other
to all kinds of religions.
The other thing is these colonies
And Maryland.
that are founded for religious purposes are not founded as Christian colonies. They're founded as Puritan colonies, Catholic colonies, Quaker colonies, Congregationalist colonies, all of which, I mean, if you look at New England, you look at the South, you have totally at odds dominant religious approaches in each of them. The Congregationalists, it's the congregation.
And for people to make sure people understand, so there are no Puritans anymore.
No.
The Puritans evolved into what are now called the Congregationalists. That's what Marshall's referring to.
And even into Unitarians, too. But you see different religious approaches. So in terms of what constitutes Christianity, dominant Christianity, not exclusively, dominant Christianity is an approach that is decentralized, that involves congregations basically running their own affairs in New England. What you have in the South is you have a completely different hierarchical approach to religion.
The Church of England.
The Church of England, which is supported by, in Virginia at least, but only in Virginia, by tithes or taxes. So the approaches to religion that you have, you can't, people have this idea, it's a Christian country, Christians founded the place, but different types of Christians that are completely...
It was a very broad spectrum.
Their religious views are completely at odds with each other.
Right.
So the idea that you could create and construct something that would unify, a core set of...
some persecuted others.
Yes, and some came here to persecute others,
That was the whole point.
Yes, they came here...
Well, yeah, and to reinforce that point is some of the colonies were founded to create havens for people fleeing from other colonies.
That were persecuting them.
That were being persecuted in the other colonies, not just in Europe or in England or wherever.
So. This is sort of looking ahead to the next one where we're going to be talking about the founders. But what's going on in Europe in the 17th century is there's all sorts of, at least in the first half, all sorts of religious wars and quasi-religious wars happening later on in the second half. And this is something that, the founding fathers are going to be repelled by, and the idea that you still have a diverse religious makeup that exists in the New World, probably much more diverse than what exists over in Britain, where you've got, or in Europe, where you've got Lutherans and Calvinists and Catholics over there. You've got a lot more moving parts over here, and this is going to create problems if you try to create a national church or establish a church, and it only gets more complicated when you get past the Second Great Awakening.
Well, you have some of the people fleeing Europe, England as well. I mean, England, but also Europe more generally,
and
Germany
and France.
They're dealing. We talked about this in the last episode. They're dealing with all sorts of religious strife in the 1600s, notably. Right, you have the 30 Years' War, terribly destructive war. 1618 to 1648. You have the English Civil War, which is what
Puritans versus, the Puritans are basically versing kind of the king.
The king. So kind of Church of England versus the Puritans.
Yes, and he's looking at a high church.
High church versus Puritans.
Versus very, very ritualistic.
And those years of the English Civil War were
1642. I mean, if you want to take it up to 1660, because that is when King Charles II comes back. But 1642 is when the Civil War kicks off.
And Charles I is beheaded in 1649.
Yeah.
And then I'm not sure when the fighting stopped.
Well, it was 48.
48. Yeah. Okay. So that era. So 1640. So you're looking at by the middle of the 17th century, you've had terrible religious strife in England itself and also in Europe more generally. People are trying to get away from that. Now, some of them are trying to get away so that they can be the oppressors.
Yeah. Right.
Others are just trying to get away so that they don't get oppressed. And
Right.
and so you have a mix, again, a mixed bag between the different colonies in terms of the makeup. But you generally seem to have those two types of people coming over, in addition to people coming over who just want to make a buck. Or I guess in those days I should make a pound. They want to come over to make money. That's their primary focus. I mean, not everybody that came over was deeply religious, devout, really cared what everybody in every church thought or anything. They just wanted to come over to
They may be
fish and crap, grow tobacco and
maybe
trap
go to
furs
church
and
when they did.
Yeah.
They weren't gonna, they weren't like wanting to practice atheism on their tobacco plantation or something like that.
I mean, they may have been believers, but they weren't as motivated by religious doctrine or anything like that.
They were orthodox in terms of the standards of the time.
It wasn't a driving force in what they did. So I think my opinion, having walked through all of this, is that you can't really pin a religious motivation on the foundation of the colonies writ large. There is some. And then again, there also isn't any in some cases.
To look at, right?
Absolutely.
Because this is the whole point
We're
of our
taking the
exercise here. It's instructive to look at.
We're taking the argument. We are looking at the argument, and we're trying to see whether it has merit, and history will actually back that up. And I would say, the idea that you can have a sort of generic Christianity. Right. Is most definitely what we did not have. There might have. I mean, you have groups like the Quakers, which are completely at odds with the Episcopalians or even the Congregationalists.
Well, not only that. I mean, agreeing with everything you're saying, right? But not only that, but then when you take another step further, even beyond that, we also have evidence from our colonial history that if you do try to have an established church, that can lead to persecution of people who don't belong to that church.
Who are still Christians.
Who are still Christians. And if you upscale that to an entire country, then, let's say the United States was founded and said, well, this is our established church, and let's say you actually settled on which one that was, we have evidence from colonial history that can lead to persecution of other Christians who don't fully agree with everything that church thinks. Because it did happen, certainly in Massachusetts it happened.
It happened in Massachusetts, and it happened... depending on what your belief structure was, it could happen elsewhere.
It could happen elsewhere as well.
And then you do have people that are fleeing the continent who don't want to be Catholic, like the Huguenots or the Moravians, who are under the Holy Roman Empire at the time.
Among a lot of Americans, Catholicism remained frowned upon until
World War II.
Very recently,
World
really.
War II.
That's a whole other story.
Yes.
But I mean, these things continue. But
I would say the divergence of religious expression and views in the colonies, combined with the Age of Enlightenment thinking that was beginning to penetrate,
that's going to happen in the next. Yes, that's going to happen in the next.
As we get closer and closer to the founding, and the drive for "quote unquote" domestic tranquility.
Yes, and I think
led specifically to the not wanting to have an established religion.
Well, let's talk about domestic tranquility. Let's look at the French here. The whole idea behind persecuting Protestants was this is a disruptive element. Everyone would be better off if everyone was Catholic. And if everyone was Catholic, then they would not be going to hell. And I, as the king, Louis XIV, I'm going to basically ensure that my subjects are orthodox in the manner of belief that I have. So this just sounds like a bit of a nightmare, looking at this through the lens of an American experience, the idea that, if you have different views, this sort of makes you disruptive. You're a disruptive force. You're a malcontent. And so you need to be suppressed regardless of conscience.
I mean, in one respect, I suppose you could make the argument that if everybody thought exactly the same thing, you could have domestic tranquility.
Yes, but
I suppose,
what a miserable place that would be.
But, first off, you're never going to have that.
No,
not everybody's
going to
agree on everything
that.
all the time. So that's one thing. And the other aspect of it is if you are a religious person, I think that Roger Williams's idea when he founded Rhode Island was that forced worship is not... It corrupts faith because you are being forced to pretend that you believe something you don't.
You're leading an inauthentic life.
You're leading an inauthentic life. You're professing, inauthentic beliefs. In a sense, you're lying. I guess you could argue, right? I think that's an important thing to consider as we look at this. Is what Roger Williams thought in Rhode Island. I think there's a lot of truth to that.
What English Catholics had to do was there were penalties if the household did not show up for church at the local Anglican church. They would send representatives of the household to attend church, and they would just sort of sit there, bide their time, and then they'd go back and wait for a priest to show up to have Mass. And so this is sort of like going through this was perfectly acceptable to Queen Elizabeth I. This was a compromise. I do not need to build windows into men's souls or something like that. But it's still, why are you forcing people to do this? What are you getting from this? And the idea is, I'm getting domestic tranquility, but you're not really.
Yeah.
You're getting conformity, and conformity is not tranquility.
And I don't want to get into everything we're going to talk about in the next episode, right here and right now. But this is actually a very good kind of preview of some of what we're going to get into next time, because among the founders was an awareness of all of this.
Yes.
And their approach, at least, I don't know if it's every single one of them, but the ones I looked at, right, they took the view, a very different view, that domestic tranquility doesn't require everyone to be forced to profess the same beliefs. It requires toleration. Some of them would phrase it. Others would say it requires a complete abolition of the state or the church, telling people what to think. That tranquility comes from people having freedom of conscience and freedom of religion and being able to worship in the way they want. Then you can have tranquility, which, even if they thought that, and many of them did, that religion was an important foundation of morality, and in fact, having religious belief was an important part of tranquility, a lot of them thought. Nonetheless, you had to be tolerant of, allow, whatever the right words are, all religious beliefs in order to maintain tranquility. That not to do so creates civil strife.
Yes.
That's it for this episode of the United States of Amnesia. Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something, and we hope you discovered new ways of looking at things you had already heard or thought about, or perhaps hadn't heard about. If you enjoyed it, that's great. If we made you mad, that's okay too. Either way, email us at usa.amnesia@gmail.com and let us know what you think. Also, let us know about anything you think we missed or got wrong. We'd like to know about that too. And of course, please like and subscribe and let your friends and neighbors know about us. We also have a website. It's www.usofamnesia.com. For Marshall, Mike, and myself, Blake Hankey. Till next time.